Okay, so now we're back with part two of Hundreds of People. We begin with Mr. Lorry noticing he thinks he's all alone in the room, and he notices Dr. Manette's workbench. So he says out loud to himself, "I wonder," said Mr. Lorry, pausing and is looking about, "that he keeps that reminder of his sufferings about him. And why wonder at that?" was the abrupt inquiry that made him start. It proceeded from Miss Pross, the wild red woman, strong of hand, whose acquaintance he had first made at the Royal George Hotel at Dover, and had since improved. "I should have thought," Mr. Lorry began. "Pah! You'd have thought," said Miss Pross, and Mr. Lorry left off. "How do you do?" inquired the lady then, sharply, and yet as if to express that she bore him no malice. "I'm pretty well, I thank you," answered Mr. Lorry with meekness. "How are you?" "Nothing to boast of," said Miss Pross. "Indeed?" "Ah, indeed!" said Miss Pross. "I am very much put out about my ladybird." "Indeed?" "Oh, for gracious sake, say something else beside 'indeed,' or you'll fidget me to death," said Miss Pross, whose character, disassociated from stature, was shortness. "Really, then?" said Mr. Lorry, as an amendment. "Really is bad enough," returned Miss Pross, "but better. Yes, I am very much put out." "May I ask the cause?" "I don't want dozens of people who are not at all worthy of Ladybird to come here looking after her," said Miss Pross. "Do dozens come for that purpose?" "Hundreds," said Miss Pross. It was characteristic of this lady, as of some other people before her time and since, that whenever her original proposition was questioned, she exaggerated it. "Dear me," said Mr. Lorry, as the safest remark he could think of, "I have lived with a darling, or the darling has lived with me, and paid me for it, which she certainly should never have done. You may take your affidavit, if it could have been afforded to keep either myself or her for nothing, since she was 10 years old. And it's really very hard," said Miss Pross. Not seeing with precision what was very hard, Mr. Lorry shook his head, using that unimportant part of himself as a sort of fairy cloak that would fit anything. "All sorts of people who are not in the least degree worthy of the pet are always turning up," said Miss Pross. "When you began it—" "I began it, Miss Pross." "Didn't you? Who brought your father to life?" "Oh, if that was beginning it," said Mr. Pross, "it wasn't ending it, I suppose. I say, when you began it, it was hard enough. Not that I have any fault to find with Dr. Manette, except that he is not worthy of such a daughter, which is no imputation on him, for it was not to be expected that anybody should be under any circumstances. But it really is doubly and trebly hard to have crowds and multitudes of people turning up after him. I could have forgiven him to take Ladybird's affections away from me." Mr. Lorry knew Miss Pross to be very jealous, but he knew her by this time to be, beneath the surface of her eccentricity, one of those unselfish creatures found only among women, who will, for pure love and admiration, bind themselves willing slaves to youth when they have lost it, to beauty that they never had, to accomplishments that they were never fortunate enough to gain, to bright hopes that never shone upon their own sombre lives. He knew enough of the world to know that there is nothing in it better than the faithful service of the heart, so rendered and so free from any mercenary taint. He had such an exalted respect for it, that in the retributive arrangements made by his own mind—we all make such arrangements more or less—he stationed Miss Pross much nearer to the lower angels than many ladies immeasurably better got up by both nature and art who had balances at Tellson's. In other words, he admires Miss Pross. There never was, nor never will be, one man worthy of Lady Bird, said Miss Pross. And that was my brother Solomon, if he hadn't made a mistake in life. Here again Mr. Lorry's inquiries into Miss Pross's personal history had established the fact that her brother Solomon was a heartless scoundrel who had stripped her of everything she possessed as a stake to speculate, that means gamble, with, and had abandoned her in her poverty for evermore with no touch of compunction. Compunction would be guilt. Miss Pross's fidelity of belief in Solomon, deducting a mere trifle for this slight mistake, was quite a serious matter with Mr. Lorry, and it had its weight in her good opinion of her, in his good opinion of her. In other words, he's horrified that Miss Pross's brother would treat her so poorly, especially because she's such a good woman. As we happen to be alone for the moment, and are both people of business, he said when they had got back to the drawing-room and had sat down there in friendly relations, let me ask you, does the doctor, in talking with Lucy, never refer to the shoemaking time yet? Never. And yet keeps that bench and those tools beside him? Ah, returned Miss Pross, shaking her head. But I don't say he don't refer to it within himself. Do you believe that he thinks of it much? I do, said Miss Pross. Do you imagine, Mr. Lorry had begun, when Miss Pross took him up short with, never imagine anything. Have no imagination at all. I stand corrected. Do you suppose you go so far as to suppose sometimes? Now and then, said Miss Pross. Do you suppose, Mr. Lorry went on, with a laughing twinkle in his bright eye, and it looked kindly at her, that Dr. Manette has any theory of his own, preserved through all those years, relative to the cause of his being so oppressed? Perhaps even to the name of his oppressor? I don't suppose anything about it, but what Lady Bird tells me. And that is? That she thinks he has. Now, don't be angry at my asking all these questions, because I am a mere dull man of business, and you are a woman of business. Dull? Miss Pross inquired with placidity. Rather wishing his modest adjective away, Mr. Lorry replied, No, surely not. To refer to business, is it not remarkable that Dr. Manette, unquestionably innocent of any crime, as we are all well assured he is, should never touch upon that question? I will not say with me, though he had business relations with me many years ago, and we are now intimate. I will say with the fair daughter to whom he is so devotedly attached, and who is so devotedly attached to him. Whoops, sorry. Sorry about that. Believe me, Miss Pross, I don't approach the topic with you out of curiosity, but out of zealous interest. Well, to the best of my understanding, and badge the best, you'll tell me, said Miss Pross, softened by the tone of apology, he is afraid of the whole subject. Afraid? Well, it's plain enough, I should think, why he may be. It's a dreadful remembrance. Besides that, his loss of himself grew out of it. Not knowing how he lost himself, or how he recovered himself, he may never feel certain of not losing himself again. That alone wouldn't make the subject pleasant, I should think. It was a profounder remark than Mr. Lorry had looked for. True, said he, and fearful to reflect upon, yet a doubt lurks in my mind, Miss Pross, whether it is good for the Dr. Manette to have that suppression always shut up with him. Indeed, it is this doubt and the uneasiness it sometimes causes me that has led me to our present confidence. Can't be helped, said Miss Pross, shaking her head. Touch that string, and he instantly changes for the worse. Better leave it alone. In short, must leave it alone like a no. Sometimes he gets up in the dead of the night and will be heard by us overhead there, walking up and down in his room, Ladybird has learnt to know that then his mind is walking up and down in his old prison. She hurries to him, and they go on together, walking up and down, until he is composed. But he never says a word of the true reason of his restlessness to her, and she finds it best not to hint at it to him. In silence they go, walking up and down together, till her love and company have brought him to himself. Notwithstanding Miss Pross's denial of her own imagination, there was a perception of the pain of being monotonously haunted by one sad idea in her repetition of the phrase "walking up and down," which testified to her possessing such a thing.